everyone. Thanks for being here. I'm just going to give it another few seconds to allow more people to join the virtual room, and then we'll get started. Hi, everyone. Just going to give it another minute to let more people join before we start. Thanks for coming. Hi, thank you so much for joining us. My name is Caitlin Vogus. I'm a senior advisor at Freedom of the Press Foundation. We are a nonprofit that defends and empowers public interest journalism. We advocate for the press and the public's right to know, and especially for more powerful transparency laws, the topic of today's event. We also build secure communication tools. We teach journalists how to keep themselves and their sources safe in the digital age. And we manage the US Press Freedom Tracker, a newsroom that monitors and documents virtually every press freedom violation in the United States. If you want to check out our work after today's event, you can visit our website at freedom.press. And if you want to support our work, please visit freedom.press/donate. We are here today to talk about the Freedom of Information Act and state public records laws. We're going to be working some FOIAs, giving you tips and tricks on best practices for how to make your public records requests that can power your journalism. And today we're really fortunate to be joined by journalists and transparency experts from across the country to talk about how they've been using both the federal and local freedom of information laws to win the release of documents that help tell important stories. These can be stories about law enforcement abuse of power, dragnet surveillance, local governments, everything in between that you can think of that touches on government. We're going to be talking about the rules for filing public records requests, also the hurdles that journalists can face, and tips and tricks for navigating the murky process. And we also want to answer your questions. So if you are a FOIA requester or use your state public records laws, please use the Q&A function in Zoom to ask your questions, and we'll ask our experts about those as well. I'm sure everybody listening today knows what a crucial role public records play in reporting on government activities, but unfortunately, access to those records is growing more and more difficult. We've seen increases in delays. Some agencies are very evasive or even hostile towards requesters, and new laws are cropping up around the country that is making transparency much more difficult and is weakening public records laws. Yet, despite these challenges, reporters are continuing to use public records to tell important stories about immigration, healthcare, the environment, and so much more. And today we're going to hear from two journalists who are doing just that, as well as FPF's transparency expert, Lauren Harper. They're going to share their experiences and offer practical tips on filing effective public records requests and appeals. So I would like to introduce our panel now. We have three great guests. We are joined by Mukta Joshi. Mukta is a local investigations fellow at the New York Times. We also have Matt Scott, the executive director of the Atlanta Community Press Collective. And last but not least, my colleague Lauren Harper, who is FPF's Daniel Ellsberg Chair on Government Secrecy. And as I mentioned, if you have questions for these experts, please do feel free to use that Q&A function. I know some folks also sent questions before the event that we'll get to as well. But I want to dive right in because we've got a lot to talk about and a lot to hear from our experts. So just to kick us off, I want to ask each of our panelists if you could tell us a little bit about why you started to use public records in your reporting, despite all the problems that I'm sure you're all very familiar with in their implementation. Why do you think they remain important and why do you continue to use them? And Mukta, maybe we can start with you.
Yeah, hi, thanks, Caitlin. So I think the first time, I'd filed a number of public records requests before, and before I pivoted to journalism, I used to be a legal researcher back in India. And I think public records across the board, regardless of country, are like so important because government entities are required to keep a number of records to just carry out their basic functions. So the information that they have is really extensive, and they provide the public a window into how the agency functions and how taxpayer money is spent. And so they're a really important transparency mechanism. But I think when I started reporting in Mississippi is where I started using public records requests the most. Um, I mean, our team started reporting on the Rankin County Sheriff's Department and other law enforcement agencies across the state. And we, I think from a reporting process perspective, I think what makes records requests so important is that they allow the agency that you're reporting on to become a part of the information seeking process. And that's how I first became interested, and that's when I first started using records requests extensively.
Matt, how about you? How do you use public records requests and how do you get started doing that?
Yeah, so public records requests were actually my introduction to journalism. I didn't study journalism in college. My background was in public history. ACPC, our organization, started. Its first big project was actually a history project, and that's how I came on board. But the founders were doing public records requests. I quickly learned how to do it, and we were interrogating a police training center here in Atlanta known as Cop City, or the Atlanta Public Safety Training Center. We weren't really getting answers from officials, and so we quickly learned that public records were the way to go. They didn't lie, they didn't obfuscate, they just showed what was happening, and so it became a regular practice for us to request keywords of public records every month and go through them and use that as the base for all of our reporting. It's a practice that we've changed over time. We're not sending the same request every month, but we've used public records and continue to use public records as the backbone, particularly for me, of my investigative reporting.
Great, and we're going to dig more into that. But before we do, I also wanted to ask Lauren, because I know, Lauren, you've been a long time public records requester. So how did you get your start, and why do you continue to use the requests even though there are all these challenges?
I got interested in FOIA completely by accident. So when I went to grad school, I was studying Middle Eastern studies and public policy, and I was convinced that when I graduated, I was gonna get a job, studying U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East. And the way it worked out when I came to DC is there was a government hiring freeze, so I did not join the federal government, was actually my initial plan. And I started off as an intern at a nonprofit called the National Security Archive, working on one of their projects that was trying to get documents released on US involvement in US foreign policy in Iraq. And while I was there, I saw that FOIA was the tool that all of the archives project used to get information released. So they had projects that were country-based, looking at, US involvement in Iraq and Afghanistan, relations with Iran. They also had projects that were looking at topics like cybersecurity and nuclear issues. Really just a diverse array of scholarship going on. But FOIA was the tool that united all of them. And I just got fascinated with it, and it really opened my eyes to the universal applicability of this tool to learn more about the world around us. And I just got hooked on FOIA policy and following FOIA as a news story. And I keep using FOIA because despite all the problems, it still works. Not as often as we would like, but even just within the last week, there were a couple of major headlines that were broken thanks to FOIA. For example, there were stories about the release of video footage of Doja's raid on the U.S. Institute of Peace. There were the release of documents showing that for about a year, ICE has known about the escalation of use of force prior to what happened in Minneapolis. So FOIA continues to get documents released. And I also feel philosophically, FOIA is so important because it's the key tool that the public has to really dictate what information the government releases, right? It's what allows the public to be an active participant in government as opposed to just a recipient of the government's whims.
Yeah, that's very true. And you were mentioning FOIA, I think referring a lot to the Federal Freedom of Information Act, but of course on the state level, states have their own public records laws. And Mukta, I wanted to ask you about that because you mentioned your reporting in Mississippi and how you've used public records law there and the Mississippi Public Records Act for your investigations. So can you tell us a little bit more about that law, how you've used it, and have you noticed strengths or weaknesses about it as you've been using it?
Yeah, so I think almost all of the requests that we've filed for our reporting over the past couple years has been under the Mississippi Public Records Act, with the exception of a few federal requests that we filed. And we've certainly had our fair share of challenges, and some of them have to do with different agencies and their attitudes towards public records and releasing them. But as far as the law itself is concerned, I think in many ways it is a standard public records law, but there are some exceptions. Like, for starters, it the fee structure, for example, like it allows each agency to determine what it considers. I mean, it allows them to charge what they consider a reasonable fee for certain records. And of course, there are limitations. Like they do need to, it can't exceed the actual cost of producing the records. And if they do include the cost of the time it took the agency to produce the record, then it has to be at the lowest it has to be the hourly wage of the lowest level of professional of employee, I mean, who's able to fulfill the request. And it's interesting because that has been interpreted in different ways by different agencies. Another thing about the Public Records Act itself is that it lacks a meaningful appeals process. And if there are issues with how uh, an agency has provided records or refused to provide records, the way to resolve that is usually to approach the Ethics Commission. And the Ethics Commission can either, I mean, accept or reject how the agency has responded, or they can issue a fine. But the only other alternative is to approach a court, which is, of course, a very time-consuming and expensive process. And also, there's the issue of the retention schedule for certain kinds of records, like video footage, for example. And I do want to talk about that at length later. But agencies aren't required to retain evidence like that for a very long time unless it's been used for evidence in a lawsuit, for example. But go back to what I said about agencies interpreting the fee schedule in various ways, um, we have been faced with certain agencies that only fulfilled their records requests through the attorney that they'd hired for this. I mean, they if they have an attorney on retainer, then they also fulfill their records requests through this attorney. And we have had an attorney in the past argue that every records request we made to them would be the subject of a potential lawsuit, which is why it was necessary for the attorney to review each request, and they were considering, I mean, including his hourly rate as the cost of the record. So there have been a bunch of issues, but for the most part, in terms of like what records um, agencies are required to provide versus certain standard exceptions like investigative files or personnel records, I think it is a pretty, more or less like a normal state records law.
I want to ask you about that issue about fees. I imagine that got quite expensive when they were claiming an attorney has to review every request. And we actually had a question from the audience in advance of the panel asking, what do you do when you get a response that says it's going to cost a major amount of money to process a public records request? How do you respond to that? How do you handle that?
Unfortunately, our approach in dealing with unreasonable responses from agencies has varied by agency. Like there have been certain instances where you can just respond to the records custodian or the clerk who's dealing with your request and tell them that, well, this is what the law says, and you're not allowed to charge beyond the actual cost of producing the records. But when we were I mean, the bulk of our reporting over the past year was we were investigating the Rankin County Sheriff's Department, and that department grew increasingly hostile to us, both in terms of their tone in communicating with us, to the ways they were like delaying our requests and not responding. And one of the major ways they were trying to disincentivize us, it seemed, was by charging we ended up spending thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars over the past year on just records requests. And I mean, we did have the option of possibly approaching the Ethics Commission with this, but given the increasing hostility and the importance for us of continuing to report on this department, we made the decision that we wanted to maintain a working relationship with them at the very least. And thankfully, we were partnering with the New York Times on these stories. And so the New York Times, in many cases, bore the costs of these records requests. But yeah, it is a challenge. And especially when like individuals or smaller news organizations are reporting on these issues, I think they do need to go the route of trying to reduce these fees or argue against them, because otherwise it totally disincentivizes people from being able to seek these records.
Lauren, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, I just wanted to add that on the federal level, the Freedom of Information Act is not free, but it is divided into several fee categories, and it really behooves requesters to know your fee category. I think that's the first step right off the bat. And my suspicion is that most of the folks who are listening to this panel today would probably fall into a preferred media or preferred fee category, whether that's member of the media, member of an educational institution, or otherwise. And that applies even if you're a freelancer. And this is important because when you are a member of one of those preferred fee categories, then agencies are only allowed to charge reasonably duplication fees after the first 100 pages. However, thanks to changes in the law in 2016, agencies can't even charge duplication fees if they don't meet their statutory deadlines to respond by, which is 20 business days, which most agencies won't do. So fee bullying is really a thing. We see agencies try to intimidate, frankly, or bully requesters sometimes with these outlandish fees. Know your fee category and be prepared to speak to that if an agency comes to you and says this will cost you, hundreds, thousands, whatever dollars, and cite the law, which is on your side typically when it comes to your fee status.
Thanks, Lauren. Matt, I wanted to ask you about your experience in Georgia, particularly with that state's public records law, the Georgia Open Records Act. Hearing what Mukta was saying, has your experience been similar under that law? What kind of strengths and weaknesses have you encountered there?
Yeah, I would say overall, the Georgia Open Records Act is actually fairly easy to work with. There are some issues like Mukta has, instead of the Ethics Commission being the arbiter, it's our Attorney General. And then we also face similar fee uncertainty. And on that point, I do my best. We don't have a lot of money backing us. So I do my best if I get pushback on fees to push back and ask for itemized explanation of the fees and challenge it where we can, and then narrow down the request. I will find some way to get the specific documents I'm seeking. It might never end up being as broad as I was hoping, but the Open Records Act, the way it's written by the legislature, there's the presumption that the documents are due, which is a fantastic place to work from. Each municipality is supposed to have a designated records officer. I work mostly in the city of Atlanta. There are designated records officers for each department. Smaller municipalities that I've worked with, there's typically like one for everything other than police, and then a police one. But that designated person should be available on the website of that municipality, so it's easier to find things. If there are exemptions, the records custodian is required to state the reason for the exemption. They can't just wholesale say, no, these are exempt. They have to give you the statute, the specific statute to which they're citing for the exemption, which gives you an opportunity to push back on the interpretation of that statute. The Georgia Supreme Court has consistently sided with requestors when it comes to Georgia Open Records Act cases. There are a few notable ones in the past decade. In 2017, there was a case, Blau versus Georgia Department of Corrections, where the GDC was attempting to wholesale withhold records. And the Supreme Court ruled that they could exempt only the specific portion that is exemptable, but they must turn over the documents, which was a big win for us. And then a couple of years ago, the Supreme Court ruled that private entities acting for and on behalf of a government agency are subject to the Open Records Act. That ruling opened those entities up to being responsive. So if I made a request, they would have to respond to me. The legislature, in response to that, and in response to a lawsuit that we'll talk about here in a little bit, changed the law. So now I have to go to the particular city agency or municipality agency to get them to in turn request those documents. But there are, civil penalties that you can seek through judicial means. So if a municipality um, delays responding, Georgia law requires that you receive a response within 3 business days. That doesn't mean they have to turn over the documents unless they're readily available, but they have to at least acknowledge and give you some sort of idea of when you'll get the documents within 3 business days, which is fantastic. If they don't do that, we could take them to court. If a judge finds that they, should have known better or willingly delayed, then they're subject to $1,000 penalty. A second violation within the next 365 days or calendar year is a $2,500 civil penalty. So there are actual penalties involved in potential obstruction, whether intentional or unintentional, of the Open Records Act.
Um, it's all quite complicated. And I mean, like you're describing a simple process, but knowing all the ins and outs can be complicated. You clearly know it like the back of your hand, but I guess I'm wondering for journalists that are just starting out, or maybe that usually work in a different state and want to file a FOIA request in Georgia or Mississippi, are there resources that you turn to inform yourself, maybe when you were new at this or when you're looking at another state? How do you kind of get up to speed on what you have to do to even make the request and where to make it?
So we had an interesting learning experience. It is quite simple. You don't have to have any sort of language. You can simply send an email and say, "I would like this," and we learned through that process of pushback on what we were requesting. Like the distinction between requesting a record or requesting information. I'm trying to think of a specific Georgia Open Records Act explainer or document. The UGA First Amendment or University of Georgia First Amendment Law Clinic, I think, had some resources. They no longer do open records work, but that we were in contact with them early on to get some advice and insight on how to do records work.
Yeah, I think also the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press has state by state guides that could be really helpful to folks. And then I don't know if this has been your experience, but also talking to other journalists who do know how to do it. My experience has been they're often willing to share their tips and tricks. So
Yeah,
that
and checking online through what other people have submitted is another way that we learned, and other great resources just to see what other journalists have done through Muckrack.
Muck yeah, I also was thinking of that one. That's a great resource as well. Lauren, you wanted to maybe add to this, but I also want to ask you about federal FOIA too. So go ahead with whatever you wanted to add.
I would just second Muckrock is a great place to go to see what other requests have been submitted. And if you're a federal FOIA requester, you can go to an agency's FOIA page. And if they've posted their FOIA logs, you can also see what everybody else has submitted to that agency within a certain time. And yes, RCFP has a great good government guide. I think it's their open government book. It's a terrific resource.
And so, speaking of federal FOIA, can you tell us a little bit, Lauren, of how that is working or not working right now?
How's it working? It's no secret that FOIA is facing a lot of problems, and it has had problems for decades. I think it's really important to note that FOIA has not lived up to its promise under Democratic or Republican administrations for decades. We've had growing backlogs, partisan interference, and Congress has never funded FOIA. And I was really interested to hear that Georgia has, penalties, financial penalties for agencies that don't comply. There's no really such thing in the federal field. So FOIA was already kind of in a tough spot, and the Trump administration has actively made it worse. We've seen this by closing FOIA offices, in some instances, firing FOIA officials after they've made lawful releases. And I think actually the biggest impact on FOIA offices is actually just kind of a byproduct of the shrinking of the government at large. So a lot of folks who worked in FOIA offices took early retirement. And this is a big deal because a lot of the knowledge that's in a federal FOIA office lives inside somebody's head. There's not necessarily the standard written procedures that you would think that there would be. So a lot of the shakeups at the federal level have an impact on how FOIA offices are operating. But I say that just to, acknowledge that there are issues, but I really don't think that requesters should be daunted by this because, as I tried to mention at the top of the hour, people are still getting records. It is true that a lot of times these records are coming through lawsuits, but we at FPF have gotten records released not through lawsuits. We've also got a lot of records from agencies that are a little bit smaller and are perhaps going under the radar. But it would be naive and probably overly Pollyanna-ish to say FOIA is working great at the federal level. That's not true, but it is still working. And I think that the more people who utilize this law and who talk about it not only in their reporting, but also possibly with their members of Congress as being an important requirement for the public's right to know, the more momentum and pressure there is on agencies to actually comply with the law. So it's still working, but it needs some help. It continues to need some help.
We have a question in the Q&A that I think is a good follow-up. The person asks, how long does it take to get information out of the US government?
It really, really, really depends. We had a FOIA request last year for an intelligence community memo that was highly classified that we got released in 7 days. It was almost the exception that proves the rule. Quite often it takes a lot longer. You can get a sense of how long an agency takes to respond to requests if you go to the Department of Justice's Office of Information Policy page. This has a report from every agency about their average processing time for requests. So simple requests, however that's defined within an agency, might have a processing time of 20 days. More complicated requests may take a couple hundred days to thousands. But we are seeing delays go up. This is happening at the same time as more folks are actually filing more and more requests with the government. But in one remarkable example, FPF filed a FOIA request with the Justice Department, and we were granted expedited processing for it. And I followed up with the Justice Department after I didn't get the document within a month and asked what an estimated date of completion was. And they said it would take 620 days, which is extraordinary. But we are starting to see longer delays. And one of the best tips that I would have for requesters, if you can't litigate, one of the best things you can do to keep your request at the top of mind for any particular FOIA office is to send an email and ask for an estimated date of completion for your FOIA request. And you can do this every 30 days, and basically that just keeps you at the top of the FOIA officer's mind. And I can tell you, as somebody who used to be a FOIA officer, that kind of stuff does have an impact because it's sort of like, they're all people on the other side of these emails. You bring it to mind, you're just going to have the natural impact of getting that FOIA office more likely to ask questions and lobby on your behalf to get those documents released if you continue to follow up with them.
Great tip. We have another question that kind of relates to that, the people on the other side of things, and something also that Mukta said earlier about wanting to have a working relationship with the Rankin County Sheriff's Office, and so not challenging some of those fees. The questioner asks, regarding the idea of working relationships with FOIA officers, I wonder, is there any advice you have about navigating requests with government agencies in smaller counties that have fewer employees? I don't want to request too much or too often and annoy them, but also if it's a right, should I just try to work past that feeling? Mukta, maybe you could field that one.
Yeah, um, that's a really good question. And given that we've filed requests with dozens of agencies around the state, and for the most part, public records officers, even in really small agencies, even if they weren't the most responsive, they were willing to have your request be an ongoing conversation and respond to you with clarifications. And what I said earlier about records requests being so useful because they allow the agency to become a partner in your reporting process. I think I think some of these agencies were a good example of that because like sometimes really small agencies don't get a lot of records requests, and so their records officers or the clerk who's dealing with your request hasn't really done this before. But being able to have a continuous conversation and help each other out and use your experience from other agencies to kind of direct them as to where they might find the records, that can be really useful. I think the example of the exceptionally hostile relationship we had with one department, I think that's kind of an exception. Um, Especially because, I mean, it is true. We were filing dozens of requests with this department. Um, but It's sometimes you can't help being annoying, you know? Like if you do need, can keep you do keep needing information. I mean, that's just the nature of the reporting that you're doing. And I'm sure it can get frustrating because like you said, there is a person on the other side. But I think that's when the question of like, yeah, this is a right that you have. Like you do have a right to know this information. I think that kind of has to be front of mind. And I guess you can like alter the language that you're using or just make an effort to humanize yourself as well. Um, but yeah, like sometimes you just can't help it. So you just have to I guess add that human touch and make it work as far as possible.
Yeah. We have another question. Matt, maybe I'll send this one your way. The person is asking for ideas on strategy to approach the request process. And one thing they're asking about is how do you even come up with ideas on requests and then how to formulate the requests. And I think the truth is there's a lot of reporting that goes on in the background before you may even file the public records request. But how do you typically approach that? Where do you get your ideas for requests? And then how do you go about deciding how you're going to actually formulate them?
Yeah, a couple of different approaches. I have a bit of a shotgun method that I do. If I think of an idea, I will send just a small request just to see what comes of it. It's often a fire and forget it. I put it on the tracking spreadsheet, and then you know a couple weeks later I'll get the request back, and that's led to stories. But coming up with an idea. So if you have something that you're pursuing, a story that you're pursuing, or have heard something from the source, there's the fantastic book, The Art of Access, by Dave Coulier and Charles Davis, where they talk about just thinking through various ways of trying to get the information. If you think of who may hold this particular piece of information, and pursuing each of those avenues. So you may get a no. Then this is where also having a good relationship with particular records officers plays. Like pick up the phone and call. Be nice. Be very kind. Be very firm that you want the thing that you want. But I am very sweet to records custodians, and you might have a better relationship with a records custodian in one department who has access to the same document and is far less likely to um, play hardball in getting you that document. So thinking of who may have access and not just going one route, but going as many routes as possible. And some, most lead to dead ends, but some records custodian somewhere may be willing to give you something that everybody else won't, and that opens up the door for more reporting. And then, what typically happens with my shotgun method is I'll get a set of documents and then I'll go through each of those documents. May not have a particular story in mind, but in going through those documents, something comes out almost every time that is worth pursuing. It's almost more than any one outlet can do, and that provides an unending list of story ideas. Is just going through documents you have. Going through old requests is something that I do when I have time, which is far more limited now than it was a couple of years ago. But going through old documents and seeing what I missed before, and then following that up with requests is a great strategy.
Thanks. Maybe we could also take a specific example. Mukta, I wanted to ask you more about the reporting you mentioned you did on, following up on the Goon Squad reporting in Mississippi. Can you maybe tell folks who are not familiar with it, first of all, like what that reporting was, what that was about, but then also walk people through a little bit of the process of requesting the records from Rankin County, and I think you also requested from the federal government as well. And, did you notice differences as you were navigating both a local process and a federal process?
Yeah, so about just to I mean I could talk about this for like an hour, but just to like quickly summarize the reporting that we've been doing in Rankin County for the past couple of years. So the story began when before I had joined Mississippi Today. So my colleagues Nate Rosenfield and Brian Howie had started reporting on the department when an incident of really horrific brutality by deputies of the same department first came to light where they had basically been torturing two men who they suspected of using drugs, and it had ended with them shooting one of the men in the mouth, and it broke his jaw. And then they tried to cover up the evidence and soon got indicted for what happened that night. And they were all sentenced to decades in federal prison. And the sheriff in that case, basically, like through all his press conferences, has maintained that these were just the actions of a few bad apples, as they call it, and that this didn't reflect like a wider culture at the department. But my colleagues spent all of 2024 reporting on the extent of the use of torture by deputies in the same department that went back nearly 2 decades. And they found dozens of incidents of deputies tasing and waterboarding people they suspected of using drugs. We kept reporting on the same sheriff's department after I joined Mississippi Today in mid 2024. And I mean, there were a few aspects of the department that we focused on, and one of them was the county jail, and the other was the number of times that the FBI had investigated incidents of excessive force by deputies of the same department over the past decade, but none of the officers who had been investigated for this were ever charged or fired for those incidents. So for that aspect of the story, we did end up requesting records not just from the sheriff's department, but also from the FBI. And also after these deputies were sentenced, the Department of Justice opened a federal patterns and practices investigation into the department. And for the longest time, especially after the Trump administration froze or withdrew from a number of similar investigations in departments across the country, it was very unclear what the status of that investigation was in Rankin County because it was one of two investigations that they hadn't explicitly announced that they were closing. So for the longest time, we were trying to request the status of the investigation. And we noticed that with the feds that they were more responsive to records requests, even if for the FBI they invoked the investigative records exemption, which we fully accepted, which we expected. Um, with the Department of Justice investigation that we're trying to figure out the status of, they at one point they responded and they said that they weren't able to disclose records of ongoing investigation. So at least that told us that the investigation was still ongoing. When it came to the sheriff's department and reporting on the jail, it was different because, like I mentioned, we were experiencing increasing hostility. But we did end up obtaining a bunch of records, and this included incident reports and jail incident reports, which basically detail like the deputies or a guard's account of what happened in a certain like notable incident. Um, we were also able to, like, when we were reporting on the county jail, so there were again two aspects of the jail that we were reporting on. So one was the sheriff's alleged use of certain inmates that were basically in his custody. It was his use of those inmates on his family's farm. And the second aspect was about this culture of violence within the jail, which involved the widespread use of force as punishment and also the use of certain inmates as enforcers in the jail to basically beat up other inmates. And we were able to, like, there's a number of records that helped us back up what we were finding and back up the dozens of incidents of violence that we were investigating. And it kind of ended up being a puzzle where the records we'd request initially based on the records that we were obtaining and the records that were denied, it kind of gave us an idea of the different kinds of records that were available. Um, and they basically like if a record refer like if a report referred to another kind of record, we would realize that this kind of information also exists. So for example, like when we're reporting on an incident of violence in the jail, which is a notoriously like secretive place. Like it isn't like people don't like commonly know like what goes on in jails. But if someone is alleging that they experienced violence there, like you can use like jail booking records to see if they were even an inmate at the time when they say this incident took place. And you can use incident reports to see if there was, I mean, if a guard noted that an incident of violence had taken place, and if that incident report mentions other people who were around when the incident took place, then you can try and reach those people who might have been witnesses. Um, so using like different kinds of records based on the situation kind of helped us get a picture of what was going on here.
Yeah, and what role did like video records play as well? I mean, body cam footage or things like that. Was that important to your reporting?
Yeah, it was really important. For the most part, the video foot because of the limitations of the agency rec of when the of how long the agency was required to retain video footage, most of the video footage we obtained didn't come from the department itself. It came like if the video footage had been used as evidence in a lawsuit, that was one of the ways we were able to obtain that footage. Um, and video footage was extremely important though, because especially now when most people consume news through their phones and through social media, I think being able to like see with their eyes what happened is really important for people to be able to resonate with your story. And unfortunately, the written word can only do so much. And we noticed that most prominently when we reported on this culture of violence in the jail, we came across a video of guards shocking an intellectually disabled man in an electric vest in exchange for a Coca-Cola. And we used that video, like that video became a part of our story. And when we made video explainers of our reporting, that was video footage we included, and that we could tell that that's what people were I mean I mean naturally like really upset people, and I think it made people like really sit with the extent of the violence and brutality in this department, in this jail. But interestingly, this video didn't come from the department. It wasn't surveillance footage. It was cell phone footage that had been filmed by a guard. And if we hadn't been able to obtain that, I really don't think the story would have resonated with people the way that it did. And it just goes to show how important video footage can be, especially now. And yeah, I really wish the retention requirements were different, because access to these kinds of records is very important.
Yeah, so it sounds like one tip if you're a journalist looking at videos, maybe act quickly if you're going to file a request for it. I know also some states have a different process for requesting body cam footage, for example. So just be aware you might have to use a different process, or you might be able to use your state public records law to request it. It kind of depends where you are. Matt, I wanted to ask you about your reporting. You mentioned using public records to report on Cop City. I was wondering if you could maybe tell folks who aren't aware of the story there, a little bit about what Cop City is, how you use public records, but also you won a significant public records lawsuit in that case, I believe, along with the Lucy Parsons Lab. So can you tell us a little bit about that case too?
Yeah, so the training center was a project that was presented to the city by a private entity, the Atlanta Police Foundation. It is, I would say, a fairly powerful organization in our city. It is the largest police foundation by revenue in the country, larger even than New York. And they presented an idea to build a police training center in a section of forest just outside city limits that had been recently enshrined in our city law as to be public parkland into perpetuity. So this paused. It was presented right after the George Floyd protests. This caused a lot of uproar from environmentalists and abolitionists or defund the police folks. And so multi-year protest movement against it. And the work that ACPC began doing was requesting documents from the city, really with any sort of keyword that we could think of related to the training center, dating back all the way to 2017 when the training center first came into conversation between the foundation and the city. What we experienced was that by outsourcing a lot of this work to the police foundation, there was not a lot of information available about the particulars of the construction process or the thinking that went behind it. It was all hidden behind this wall of the private entity. And so we continued to battle for records and got everything that we thought we could get from the city. And in that process, the foundation had sent meeting minutes to the city of their board meeting, which was a source of a couple of stories that I was able to do and something that we wanted to pursue. So we sent a request directly to the police foundation for some of those board meeting minutes and for some other things, and got no response from them. So it took about a year and a half to actually get before a judge. But we were suing to get those documents and to ensure that the police foundation itself would be subject to the Open Records Act, with the purpose of getting to a point where government agencies could not use private entities as a black box where they could offshore all of their work and ensure that nobody saw what was going on. A judge sided with us. Maybe walked a very fine line between expanding the Open Records Act, but simply said that records are presumed to be due, and part of the issue was the police foundation did not like our reporting. They did not like what happened from our reporting and did not want to turn over the documents for that reason. And so the key was to that for the judge was the records are due no matter who the requester is. So we've continued that pursuit of private entity records now into working on flock stories. These flock safety audits of the license plate readers have done a lot of work in the investigative journalism world. Started with that 404 media story, and since then, Flock has lost about $1 billion worth of its valuation since that story came out, showing, I would say, the importance of good investigative journalism. But Flock, the software of Flock produces the audits, and now what we've seen is that Flock has changed how these audits are produced. They've begun redacting some of the key information, like search reasons or the names of officers who have conducted the searches. So we are running again into the question of what control does a private entity have over the public records process. This will likely end up with us going back to court, but we're still in the early stages of that.
Yeah, and this relates to a question someone's asked in the audience for Lauren about, I know this is an issue you followed too, Lauren, around this kind of interaction between federal agencies and but private contractors, and how does that work with FOIA? And this person asks whether you have any insights or thoughts on records that exist in between agencies or in between agencies and their private contractors, where FOIA offices sometimes are not always in agreement on who has custody or authority over the records in question. How does it work at the federal level?
It is so frustrating, and it's such a good question. The answer is it's frustrating. To take a step back, so the way the federal records defines, what is an agency record, it's something that an agency either received or created. So you can file a FOIA request with a federal agency for something that they receive from a third party or from another agency. And this is really important, especially right now as the size of the government is shrinking and more federal agencies are doing more with contractors, consultants, third parties, etc. So knowing kind of how to navigate this is really important. When you're filing these kinds of requests, the exemption that you're most likely going to be met with is exemption 4. So the federal FOIA has nine different exemptions that agencies can cite to withhold information. And the one that you are most likely to run up against when you're trying to get third-party records in particular is exemption 4. What exemption 4 is it is supposed to, within parameters, protect commercial or financial information that a company is required to give to the government. And an agency can only withhold that information if release of that information would reveal, trade secrets, cause competitive harm, etc. But it is increasingly being used as a catch-all to hide all communication between the government and third parties, which is absolutely an abuse of the exemption. And I'd add that it's something that Congress is well aware of. But in one pretty grave example from last year, SpaceX, which is an Elon Musk company, started stamping a line at the bottom of all of their emails that they shared with a federal agency that SpaceX declared were exempt from public records release because it contained confidential business information. So, what I would suggest, first and foremost, if you get a denial based on exemption 4, the first step is obviously to appeal it, especially if you suspect that a private company is trying to dictate what information gets released. Because exemption 4, like all other exemptions, has thresholds that an agency has to meet for it to be applicable. So really the most basic thing is to file an appeal and basically argue, one, public interest is what the public interest argument is one of the best ones that you can make in overcoming a host of exemptions. We talked earlier before, I believe Mukta was talking about trying to get access to records about investigations. One of the most powerful arguments in any appeal for a lot of these exemptions is that even though you could technically withhold it, the argument in the public interest overcomes that hurdle. And this is something that courts do sometimes side with requesters on. So I would get that appeal submitted. And if you're curious about, what are the strongest arguments to make for those appeals, particularly for exemption 4, one of the best resources to go to is something called the FOIA Wiki, which was started by Adam Marshall at Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press. It's basically a Wikipedia page for all things FOIA. And one of the things it does for each exemption, you can go to exemption 4, you can see the threshold that agencies are supposed to rely on to apply that exemption. And then you could look at all the case law that has challenged it. And you can kind of boil down, okay, this is when requester won, this is when a requester lost, and you can try and use those arguments in your own appeal. But it is difficult. And I will say that one of the things, that's the third party element. The other thing that comes up is interagency communication. So let's say maybe the CIA is communicating with the Defense Department, and there's an argument that from the CIA that no, this isn't our record, this is a Defense Department record. And oftentimes what happens with these requests is they can fall into something called a referral black hole because there's no timeline when something goes on referral about when an agency has to get back to you on. And so if you're not going to sue, really one of the most effective things you can do, for example, if you haven't gotten an official denial yet, is to follow up with the agency, because an agency is supposed to tell you, we've referred this request or portions of this request to other agencies. You ask for which other agencies specifically, and then you follow up with all those entities with estimated dates of completion. And I understand, especially with smaller entities not wanting to be too annoying, but you become annoying. Otherwise, these requests can get ignored for quite a long time. So to sum up, file those appeals, the estimated date of completion, and use resources like the FOIA Wiki to cite specific case law that can help you overcome these claims from agencies about particularly third-party records.
Thanks, Lauren. I want to get to as many of the audience questions as we can. So here's another one from the audience. They say that there's someone who's relatively new to FOI requests, and they're wondering, how do you decide on the right balance in the scope of your request? Is it better to lump everything on your wish list in the first request, even if it's going to take longer that way? Or is it instead better to aim smaller and start with only the most important things? And this person is especially worried about, if local authorities get your first FOIA request and then think they need to start covering up stuff, maybe you've blown your shot at getting other stuff later. So, Matt, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, this is something that we deal with. My instinct is to go as large as possible as I can, or as long as possible in terms of time frame, large as possible in terms of search terms or something like that. That I think I can get away with without being charged. And then if I get charged, I'll shrink some of those items. But in terms of I can definitely understand the fear of you sending that request and triggering concern within the agency that they will start to cover that up. There then becomes documents about that. There are data retention policies. There are metadata processes where you can find out if things are deleted. That becomes a whole story itself. That is something that actually kind of happened in Atlanta. The city of Atlanta played a little dangerously with Open Records Act and end up getting sued by a local paper and TV station, and had to create a whole office of transparency because of how they treated the Georgia Open Records Act. So there's a concern for sure about what your request can prompt on the other side, but I would lean towards making the request and making them consistently and within a defined scope, but being flexible and willing to go back and change that. I think I would treat FOIA differently. I'll let Lauren answer that. On a state level, we get pretty quick responses, but if I was looking at a larger response window, that would probably change my calculus a little bit.
Lauren, any thoughts on when you're at the federal level? Do you want to go broad, or what do you want to do?
It really depends what you're looking for. Typically, what I find to be the most effective, one, always have a date range and try to identify as many keywords and search terms and individual officers as you can. Because one of the things that's important to keep in mind at the federal level is when you file a FOIA request to a FOIA officer, that FOIA office is most likely not running that search. They don't have access to the records that you're looking for. What they have to do is be able to look at your request and figure out, let's say it's a State Department, for example, look at your request and say, okay, this would most likely have records if I send it to, the Bureau of Near Eastern Affairs or something like that. So you want your FOIA request to be specific enough to allow a FOIA requester to figure out who to task that FOIA request to. That's really the biggest thing that you can do. And as a way to understand that better for yourself, I really recommend taking a look at agency organizational charts and trying to figure out which components of what agency handle which kind of records to really give the FOIA officer a roadmap to help you get that request filled. I also, I've gotten requests back from FOIA officers when I thought the request that I submitted was actually pretty tailored. And the FOIA officer has come back and said, look, I mean, yes, it is, it's a perfected request, but this is going to take me forever to get these records back to you. And what I like to do, I usually treat a FOIA officer as someone who's a colleague and who's going to help me get those records. What I will sometimes do is I will say, can we look at a sampling of requests within that universe of documents? And that can help me decide if what I'm asking for is actually getting me the documents that I want, or if perhaps it's too broad and can be narrowed further. Other times I'll ask a FOIA officer, like if I'm looking for records across, let's say, an entirety of an administration, what I might do if a FOIA officer comes back to me and asks me to narrow, I might say, okay, just look at records from this month. Let's start there. And then perhaps, I could break it down into one request per month, whatever makes it easier for your office to handle. But I think, the most important things to keep in mind is that FOIA officer might not know where those records are without you telling them. So, try and give them a roadmap and, provide them all the clues and the breadcrumbs that you can to help them find those records, and be willing to have a conversation in good faith about narrowing, because oftentimes the FOIA officer on the federal level really is your ally in trying to advocate to get those documents out. There are some agencies where this isn't true, but for the most part, the FOIA officer is trying to help you. So don't be hesitant to have a phone call.
Yeah, it's a bit of a negotiation process. Yeah.
Mhm.
We have another question from the audience that could any of our panels could take. This person asks, What are some of the biggest mistakes people make when they are submitting a FOIA or a Public Records Act? Is there anything you've learned from in the past or seen others do if you don't want to admit to your own mistakes?
If just one super quick one that comes to mind is requesting, like asking questions rather than requesting specific records. I think it always helps to know like the name of the document that would contain the information that you're requesting.
Yeah, that's a great one, right? They're not required to create records or answer questions. It's just like finding the document. Yeah.
One of the best things you can do is also include citations that the document that you're looking for exists. On the federal side, a great place to look for those citations is, for example, official biographies, public statements, or even congressional testimony and hearings, and basically say, look, this record exists, and here's a public record acknowledging the existence of that request. So including in your upfront request evidence that the request exists is great. I also think one of the things that I see people do is spending a lot of time trying to write their initial FOIAs really perfectly, which I appreciate. There should be a lot of research that goes into that. But I would also say, we're also at a stage where responses to FOIA requests by some agencies, particularly at DHS and ICE, appear to be blanket denials no matter what. So be mindful when you get a response from an agency to open it in a timely fashion, because the FBI, for example, your token to open your request expires after 48 hours. Read that and see if there's a deadline by which you need to respond by and get your appeal in time. Because sometimes, and increasingly at federal level, your request is not really getting thorough consideration until it reaches that appeal phase. So try and stay on top of your correspondences and get those appeals in.
Good tips. Matt, any mistakes that you've learned from in the past?
Not following up. It's
Uh,
things get lost. These people, these custodians are busy. It's understandable. And I've gone back and looked at records requests that I've made and said, I wish I had followed up on that. That story is like long gone, and I missed my opportunity. But just I try to make a practice of sending an email every couple weeks just to check, just to see where things are at, and that skill has helped tremendously. It took me longer than I care to admit to learn.
That's great advice. We've been talking for an hour, but there's so many great audience questions that we're going to keep going. So if anyone, if folks need to leave, we understand the recording of this event will be up later on YouTube. So if we haven't gotten to your question yet, you can go back and watch later. So I am going to keep going through audience questions because that's the whole point of this. We really want to get to your questions. We have a question that maybe would be best for Lauren. This person asks, if the target of your investigation is alive, what are some strategies to FOIA the DEA or other law enforcement agencies to get information on the target, maybe without directly using their name? Because this person says it's been my experience that law enforcement agencies normally won't approve FOIA requests for someone who's still alive.
Yeah, that's tough. I'll acknowledge, right off the bat, that's tough. I think one of the best things to do when you're filing a FOIA request, particularly for somebody who's still alive, and let's assume you don't have written permission from that individual to obtain government records about them, is to argue that release of those records is in the public interest. As I mentioned before, this is something that courts really do weigh over, for example, ongoing investigations or even personal privacy for folks who might be subject to ongoing investigations. So do your best to make really strong arguments in favor of the public interest, in favor of disclosure. I mentioned FOIA Wiki a little bit earlier. If you go to, for this specific question, if you go to FOIA Wiki's entry on B7C in particular, you'll see a lot of case law that I think that you could possibly apply to your request or an appeal when it comes to that. Another tactic to do with law enforcement requests is to make it more about the government action that included that individual than directly asking for records about an individual. So let's say the person that you're interested in was involved in a raid or a shooting or whatever it is. I would craft the request a little bit more broadly and have it focus on the government activities during those raids and see what records you can hopefully get back that would illuminate what you're looking for about this particular individual. In some ways, kind of camouflage what you're asking for by making the more explicit subject of the request about what the government did that may have involved this person.
Good tips.
Just to add to that super quickly, in my experience, especially when it came to us requesting like incident reports, not just in jail, but also regarding arrests, I don't think we've had any trouble getting those records. Like, for example, if we ask for a 2nd February 2022, like an incident report detailing the 2nd February 2022 arrest of so and so individual, like we've always gotten those. And then when it came to jail records, we were able to request like all segregation records for named inmate or all incident reports involving John Doe, for example. So that really hasn't been an issue.
Interesting. So maybe less of an issue at the state level, or just depending on what state or what agency you're working with. Yeah. There's another question here asking about whether anyone has had special problems with requesting emails or texts. I see
I
some nods.
yes, I'll let our guests answer first, but yes.
Yeah, the problem that we've run into is that it ultimately ends up being the person whose text I'm going after is the one who is taking screenshots of their own phone and turning those over, which defeats the entire purpose. Like the question about covering up stuff, like this is where that would come into play. I think the most for me. I never want the person I am targeting to be the one responsible for turning documents over to me. Particularly with text, also, the Atlanta Police Department started, and many other police departments have started using Signal. So there are always questions over disappearing messages, whether those were activated or not, whether new chats have been created. So the record trail gets a lot harder, I would say, when it comes to text messages and chat messages. Emails, I haven't had any real problem with. But, there's always metadata available, and worst case scenario, most of these agencies use Outlook, and you can request snapshots of Outlook inboxes for a certain date, and shows if they deleted anything like that. It keeps it. There's a longer track that you can take with emails from government agencies.
Yeah, one thing I would add is that there's also the issue of whether people are using personal devices versus work devices. I mean, I think this is an issue that's been litigated a lot of places, and I think the case law is trending in the right direction of, if you're doing government business, even if you're using a personal email address, it's still a public record. I'm sure there's some outlier cases that say it's not, but that's something to watch out for. And then also if people are using email aliases, even on their official government emails, sometimes especially for high-ranking officials, they might have an alias that's not, John Smith at whatever agency.gov. They use something a little bit secret. And if you don't know that as a reporter, you might miss out on records that you don't know to request from that alias. But Lauren, did you want to add more?
Yeah, one of the things that comes up, so in terms of Signal and personal emails, the rule on the federal side, most agencies allow for use of private email or even Signal and other, private third-party messaging devices, as long as those officials transfer those records in their entirety to federal record-keeping systems within 20 days. Of course, it's an outstanding question of whether or not this happens, but that is the rule. And one of the biggest issues that you run into requesting email from federal agencies, which are extremely large in most cases, is that you don't necessarily know the name of the custodian or the email construction of the folks that you're trying to see records of. So, for example, if you're trying to file a FOIA request for records about, let's say, tariffs, about, steel or something like that from the Commerce Department, you one are challenged by the fact that you don't know off the bat the way emails are constructed across the Department of Commerce. The Bureau of Industry and Security has a different email format than other portions of that. And oftentimes, what a FOIA officer will come back and say is, by the way, I can't search bureau wide for these emails, so I need specific email addresses for the records custodians that you're looking after. And that is impossible for the public to know, especially when there's not a public facing directory of agency employees. So, one of the things that I do and it's not perfect, but it's a way to narrow, is I ask for emails of all individuals within a bureau above a certain seniority. And that helps narrow it pretty quickly. And my hope is when I do that, with the responses that I get show that those senior officials, communications with other folks whose email addresses I didn't know beforehand. But really, the biggest challenge is agencies increasingly say, okay, you want emails? You have to tell us whose email addresses you want us to search. And that puts FOIA requesters in a catch-22.
Yeah, and often they redact the email addresses when they release the records too. So then you're like, how am I ever supposed to figure this out?
Correct.
Almost like they don't want you to figure it out.
It's almost like that. Yeah, but it's interesting that the Commerce Department, for example, the one entity will not redact emails at all, and another agency will. So if you're going with one bureau that doesn't redact email addresses, they might apply knowingly or not a somewhat different or more lenient redaction code to other bureaus within that department that they communicate with, just because they're not familiar. So that sometimes works in your favor.
Yeah, true. We have another question that I guess anyone could take. It's asking, how do you handle requests in states that require you to be a resident to file a public records request? Has anybody run into this?
I haven't run into it, but from other people who have, they usually like find a friend or something.
Yeah.
Like,
Also, yeah, find a proxy who lives in the state who will file it for you. Yeah. Gosh, we've got so many good questions. I'm going to do a few more before we have to bring it to a close, if that's okay with our panelists. Okay. So someone asks about trying to FOIA like computer programs. And I want to expand this question a little bit more. Has anyone tried to FOIA things like code or large agency databases, that kind of like spreadsheet, yeah, or computer programs? Is that kind of thing generally available under public records? Has anyone attempted that?
yeah, so when we were reporting on, again, the sheriff's department last year, we were trying to request all expenditure done by the sheriff's department, which I mean goes through the board of supervisors. And so we were trying to request these expenses from the county itself, and it existed on a digital database or some sort of spreadsheet. And so we requested, I mean, surely it existed in some sort of digital format or a spreadsheet. So we explicitly requested that data in digital form. But I don't know why, but they refused to do that. And what they did instead give us was a cardboard, like a big cardboard file box of just like a giant stack of more than 1,000 sheets of paper. And they weren't labeled or anything. So we came back to our office and we just saw like this giant stack of paper, which was clearly like some sort of printed spreadsheet, but we couldn't make sense of it. And then we realized that what this was, it's like so hard to describe, but like imagine a giant spreadsheet that has 10 columns. So it was like the sheets of paper were divided with like 5 columns on one piece of paper, and the next 5 columns on another piece of paper, but they were all like stacked together. And so we basically, like when we realized that that's what it was, we realized that we had to figure out like where the stack cut off. And so we basically like reconstructed this database on the floor of the newsroom. And we basically, like, for example, like we figured out that 66 pages is where it restarts and then creates like the next row, next set of rows. And so then after we reassembled this database, we basically scanned each stack, and then uploaded the scanned PDFs onto Google Pinpoint, which basically makes like PDFs searchable. And then that's how we were able to access the data in the database. And we were able to use that spreadsheet actually to find more than $150,000 of potentially misspent taxpayer funds. But yeah, it was if a record exists in digital form and you request it in digital form under the Public Records Act, that's how they're obligated to hand it over. But they refused to do that. And also it was, I mean, it would have been really difficult for us to like fight this and like go back and forth because the attorney for the county insists on only communicating through snail mail. He doesn't respond to emails. So every time we had to like request like a clarification or something, we had to literally like write him a letter. And so we just decided to just deal with it and make the database ourselves.
That's absolutely crazy. Good for you for not giving up and for reassembling it all. I mean, that's, yeah. What you said about the snail mail reminds me of something else too, which is that I think some agencies are also taking step back technologically for even filing public records requests. Um, I've had to file FOIA requests using fax machines. Some agencies will take them by email, but some won't. Lauren, maybe at the federal level, what are you seeing in terms? Can you just email a request? What's the deal with the federal FOIA portal? Is that a thing still or ever?
Sure. So the federal agency that famously only communicated by fax for a really long time was the CIA. I have memories of many years standing by our agency, our nonprofit fax machine, just hoping that the CIA fax machine was on and it would accept my FOIA request that day. But we've actually gotten to a point where most federal agencies are part of FOIA.gov. This is the National FOIA portal where you can go and file a FOIA request with almost any agency across the government. The other portal that's used by DHS and a couple other smaller components is Secure Release. So if you're filing a FOIA request for ICE records or CBP records, you're going to go to the Secure Release portal. And DHS has actually said we're not going to accept emailed FOIA requests anymore. You have to use the Secure Release portal, which is kind of interesting because what happens if DHS ever goes off that portal? So portals are actually the most efficient way to file FOIA requests for most federal government records, but they are not without their flaws. One, they rely on people being internet savvy and having internet access, which, a lot of folks are, but certainly not everybody. And two, it makes it pretty difficult. All it requires of an agency is that you submit your FOIA request through a certain portal. But an agency may come back to you via email, via a system called PAL, or what have you, and start communicating with you in a completely different way. So you may have records that are submitted through one entity, and then you start receiving them back in another format, and it can be kind of difficult to keep that stuff together. One of the other drawbacks of the secure release portal, for example, is if an agency denies your request for being not perfectly requested or being too broad, it won't automatically generate an appeal function. So you have to go to the agency website and be like, okay, what's their FOIA liaison address? And now I have to submit an email to this person and basically be like, here's my appeal, rather than going through the portal. So they're not without their flaws. But I will say, in general, FOIA portals are the way that the governments or federal agencies are going. There are pros and there are cons to that.
Thanks. I'm going to do one more audience question. I'm actually going to combine a couple of questions we've gotten because they're along a similar theme. But several people have asked about what concerns you might have as a journalist filing a FOIA request these days, especially in a climate where there are increasing attacks on the press, increasing attempts to criminalize reporting, surveillance of journalists. Do you ever have concerns as a reporter that by filing a FOIA request, you are, I don't know, getting put on some list for further scrutiny or may even be retaliated against for filing a records request?
I don't, I'm not a reporter in the typical sense, but I will say that I don't.
I think our reporting over the past year, I mean, we have been told, I mean, the department has, I mean, he made it pretty clear that he knew, like he kept hinting at the fact that he knew like where we were working out of and like where one of our colleagues lived. And I think like we were just the sheer number of records requests we were filing, like it was pretty clear that we like that it was no secret that we were doing this reporting. And like, yeah, sometimes it did feel like if they wanted to retaliate, they could. But also, I think the importance of reporting and constantly seeking information and having them turn it over is that it keeps the spotlight on the agency and on the subject of your reporting. And there's only so much you can do if everyone's watching, you know?
Yeah, that's true. Well, I don't want to And on such a down note, although Mukta, that was a great, reason why this reporting is still important. But just quickly before we wrap up, I wanted to give folks one last chance. We can go around. If there's a piece of advice that you have for folks in the audience that we didn't get to, that's something we didn't get to touch on about filing a public records request or using public records for your reporting, what's a piece of advice that you would want to leave people with today? And I hate to call on someone first. I know that's hard. So, Matt, do you want to try to go first? Do you have something in mind?
Yeah, I would say, my advice is just get started. Just do it. If it's not something you're familiar with, just start doing it. It doesn't have to be perfect. The records officer will tell you if it's not perfect and it doesn't work, then you go back and adjust. But my biggest piece of advice is to make it a habit, to set aside time every week, to make it a habit to submit records requests. I have friends who submitted a request today. They are very cool. I wish I did that. But set aside some time every week so I am going to be sending out a request and following up on all of my requests.
Yeah, if you didn't make a New Year's resolution, you can make one now to public records request every day. Mukta, any advice?
Yeah, first of all, that's really great advice, Matt. Like I remember being so intimidated by the idea of having to file a records request and just having it be a cloud over my whole day. Like, oh my God, this is something I need to do today. But just the sheer number of requests we had to do over the past couple years, like it's just second nature now. You want some information, you just shoot an email and you get it done. But something that was super useful was dedicatedly keeping track of your records requests and the status of the requests and just maintaining a spreadsheet of like the date you file the request and who the agency and what agency it was and who the records custodian is and what you were requesting and the status of the request and whether it's been paid for already and whether, I mean, you have the invoice and if it's been denied, then the reasons why it was denied, like having a notes like that really, really makes all the difference because otherwise there's truly no way to keep track.
Yeah, very true. Organization is key when you're filing so many requests.
Can
Lauren,
I
how about,
toss in one thing about the
oh,
spreadsheet? Add a
yeah.
why column to remind yourself why you sent this request in the first place. That was a game changer.
Okay, good to know. Lauren, any advice you'd want to leave people with?
Spreadsheets are key. I cannot underscore that enough. I think just don't be too cynical to get started. I think there's a lot of, reason for cynicism, especially around the federal side of things, but don't be too cynical. Don't let that prevent you from filing your records request in the first place. And after you've done that, follow up, whether that's with estimated dates of completion or just responding to an agency when they reach out asking for clarification or a phone call. And finally, appeal. Agencies release something like a third of more information on appeal, so they're really worth your time. So follow up, file them initially, and keep a spreadsheet to keep yourself organized.
All right. Well, thank you so much to all of our panelists. I really appreciate all of your expert tips and advice and sharing your stories about why public records have been reporting important to your reporting. And I hope you've inspired some other journalists in the audience to go out and file requests every day or every week or at least occasionally. Thanks to the audience for joining us as well and for your great questions. I'm sorry we couldn't get to everybody's, but we answered as many as we could. If you want to read more from our panelists today and you want to follow their reporting, you can definitely do that. You can check out Mukta's reporting at the New York Times or at Mississippi Today, nytimes.com or mississipitoday.org. You can follow Matt's work by visiting atlpresscollective.com to read more about what he's up to. And you can follow Lauren's work at Freedom of the Press Foundation by visiting freedom.press/the-classifieds. And if you want to learn more about FPF in general, you can visit our website or subscribe to our newsletters by going to freedom.press/newsletters. And again, if you found this useful and you want us to do more of these FOIA tips and tricks events and advocacy to keep strong public records law, please consider donating to us if you can. And you can do that by visiting freedom.press/donate. So thank you again so much to everyone and keep going out and working those FOIAs. Thanks.